Before I get into giving visualizations to the dimensions as I currently see them, I'd like to take a moment to think of the quantitative realm in general in a different, possibly even a new way. So first, let us explore the substance behind the numbers 1 and 0. Like, what is 1? What is 1 all by itself? Does it hold any meaning in and of itself? Without any substantive context to put it in? Because you can put 1 and 1 together, and depending on the context, you can get 2. Or to say that they're numerically together and say it's 11. Or you don't really know the context of 1 all by itself. 1 what is the question we should be asking. Bring 2 humans together can also make 3 humans if the humans are male and female and they happen to be involved with each other. Or they could be 0 humans if they are 2 men shooting at each other in a war. So why do we insist that 1 and 1, when put together, necessarily equals 2, without any substantive context to the numbers that we are given? The possibilities are endless, so it's like, in this line of thinking, what is 0? Unlike 1 and all of the numbers indicating substance, its lack of substance is certain. 0 what? It doesn't matter. 0 humans, 0 apples, 0 universes, all indicate a lack of the thing we are trying to count. It doesn't matter if it's 2 live humans killing each other to make 0 live humans, or 1 matter and 1 antimatter particle coming together to make 0 matter particles, or even simply 1 plus -1 equaling 0. What would you say division is? Is it not just asking how many things of substance can be redistributed into another thing of substance? And aren't just fractions just a reiteration of an incomplete division problem? Why is it, for example, that the closer we get to 0 in the equation 1 divided by 0, the closer we get to infinity? Why is that the case? Reiterating what I said in part 1, I say that rather than saying we cannot divide by 0, let us take the next logical conclusion and say that 1 divided by 0 is positive infinity. And what would you say infinity is? Infinity is just an endless logical vector. When we put an arrow at the end of a line, we are telling that line to keep on going, and going, and going, forever. I suggest that 0 is also an endless logical vector, an infinitely small point that in and of itself contains an infinite amount of decimals, that if we were to count the numbers between 0 and 1, it would take an eternity just to spend the time counting the decimal places before we even start considering the other decimal points of substance. And if you were to observe an infinitely small span of space, you would be observing the 0th dimension as I see it. A single point, like that. The logical and mathematical inverse to infinity, where only quantitative measurements and the logic it contains can exist. You can imagine the point like this period, but even that crude representation is a lot bigger than an atom, and if we could imagine from the perspective of a hydrogen atom, or even a single electron, and blew it up to the size of the whole Milky Way galaxy, the 0th dimension would still be smaller than that point. That point. Now, just like infinity and the quantifiable elements that comprise it, 0 is just an idea, the manifested concept of pure nothingness. If we can imagine infinity as an endless vector protruding out from that point, the point itself would be an endless vector array imploding in on itself in all directions. Now in this picture I gave an approximate artist demonstration of what I'm trying to get at for what the point is. Like this whole area around here is the point. And it's like the starting point for infinity. So everything that goes out from that point, if it's an infinity vector, can be equal to infinity. So the idea of the point is like it goes inward on itself. It keeps on getting smaller, 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 just like infinity gets bigger, bigger, bigger. If that makes sense. So therefore, the point itself is unreachable, as the notion of the point itself is contingent on 0 the infinite. As infinity is never really reachable, but we can conceptualize it down to a simple vector, so is the 0th dimension never really reachable, but we can conceptualize it down to a point. We can say we are made up of an infinite amount of 0th dimensional points. But I would love to be wrong on this point, And I would enjoy observing the point as finite, because then the point's properties wouldn't appear as a bottomless pit of nothingness or an endless void of nothingness, but more like a hole, perhaps even like a subatomic black hole that can clearly be distinct from the subatomic black hole right beside it. And apart from the huge finite lattice of other subatomic black holes that would make up our reality. But my untestable hypothesis is that if you zoomed in onto a single subatomic black hole on this fundamental lattice, you would find something like the same subatomic black hole, an infinite abyss of nothingness. So if this point had another point right next to it, if you zoomed in on one of the points, you would like see the same structure again and again. It's like, oh, it doesn't matter how many of these there are, it'd be like an infinite imploding, if that's a good enough visual for you. Inventing the equipment that will make it feasible for our species to be able to observe the zeroth dimension will definitely be a multi-generational problem, and I don't know what to say. Just start by making stronger and stronger microscopes and some sci-fi shrinking machines, and that's all I have to say about that. It's not much you can do at the moment. You just have to like assume the point is there, but it's like it logically exists, but you can't like prove it exists. So from now on, when I start talking about higher dimensions, you can keep in mind that every point on each of the dimensional planes that I speak of is actually the zeroth dimension. But to keep things simple and consistent, I will do my best to refer to them as points from now on. So now we will ask, what is the first dimension? Well, let's take a look at this picture. So you got a point. Now you just take any other point. Oh look, there's one right there. How convenient. So we'll just take these 2 points and we'll have them point infinity vectors at each other. So this point's infinity vector looks like this, and this point's infinity vector looks like that. So they shoot, they fire, and every point that is in the crossfire is part of the first dimension. It's a line. And the line segment connecting the 2 points represents finite and measurable space, which we will call length. Yes, mass is actually the first dimension in this DQ melt model that I'm presenting, but for learning purposes, it is a lot easier to start with length and time because that's the ones we most intuitively deal with. So firstness is relative. But the line, or rather the line's physically manifested illustration, is not the dimension itself, per se. And it's certainly not a specific place or destination that you end up with the use of a portal gun. The dimensions are directions, and the line is there just to let us communicate the dimension's orientation. And a dimension's orientation is important in relation to other dimensions. Now, as far as imagining the second dimension goes, you can either imagine it perpendicularly or parallelly. So I guess I can just get into it. Perpendicularly, you can take any point that is not on the one-dimensional line that I have here. So we'll just take this point. Oh, how convenient, it's already there. And we will connect it with the point that is closest to it. It's the point that creates the smallest amount of space that you can between that point and the point on the 1D line. It is a 90-degree angle. So you take these 2 lines and you have them point infinity vectors at each other in addition to the infinity vectors from the 1D line, and ta-da, 2D. But if you only think about it perpendicularly, you might come to the conclusion that that only the points on the line are a part of 2D space. So parallelly, this will help get what 2D space is better, is that you take every point that is on the one-dimensional line and you make a 90-degree new line coming out from that point. So you'd have a line here, 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 and they just keep on stacking on top of each other, and every point on every line would be part of the second dimension. It is a plane. It's like a gigantic piece of paper. So when you're imagining the second dimension perpendicularly, the point that is the intersection between one-dimensional line and the second one-dimensional line is the point of singularity. It is the coordinate 0, 0 in 2D space, or in 3D space, it is the coordinate 0, 0, 0. You can add this concept to as many number of dimensions as you want. Like I said earlier, it is almost like an infinitely large piece of paper, except that the paper is so thin that you can see right through it and pass through it. It is one of the qualities of space. So this is what length squared looks like, sort of. So what is the third dimension? Well, for 3D space, you can use the same logic to come up with any number of dimensions after this. So I'll just be using artistic templates to help try to illustrate how these building of dimensions can go and how you can build that pattern for yourself. So imagine any point that is not on the 2D dimensional plane that we have already established. Like, we'll just imagine that, maybe even better, pretend it's off the page, because this is only an artistic generalization. So we'll just imagine that there is a point coming that is, well, from your perspective, right here, right off the paper, and going straight through and going out the other side of the wall. That would be a three-dimensional plane. And I tried to artistically designate a 3D object in 3D space, but I mean, you're watching a video and all you can see is really 2D space right now. I know that might sound weird, but trust me, you're only seeing 2D things right now. You can imagine depth going on, but you're not really getting, like, you're not seeing the back of my head. If you could see the back of my head, you would be seeing a full 3D object. Like, if you're just looking at this cube right here, you're not seeing the full back of it. You're going to only see the back of it because it's transparent, and that's the way I drew it. But if you're just looking at it from one side, you're only seeing this part of the cube. I hope that makes sense. So, as I said, this is space as we intuitively call space, with left and right being the first dimension, up and down being the second dimension, and forward and back being the third dimension. So another way of imagining the third dimension is that you are stacking two-dimensional planes right on top of each other infinitely. Well, I guess maybe stacking isn't the best word. Here, let me use the whiteboard to try to explain this. Instead of stacking, imagine, we'll go back to the second dimension as an example. So once you have the dimensional planes exist, well, we'll just say that these are the points of Aleph Null. So this is all of finite and measurable space. That is all of the limits of what we would be able to map out and coordinate. But once you have this in place, you can plot out an infinite amount of lines that protrude from that space. And if you did this enough times, I'm going to try to just be approximate. Like, if you do this enough times, you will eventually get to the point of creating something that looks a little bit like a circle, as you can see right there. And if you had the arrows at the end of all of these, you would see that finite and measurable space, even though is only limited to us by a square, would end up looking more like a circle in the infinite scheme of things. So anytime you hear the term stacking to describe the parallel nature of the next higher dimensions, in this video, I really mean to configure and stack every possible 1D line that could result in an infinity vector that could result from your allotted dimensions. Now, in 3D space, you and I go through it no problem, but we can never quite leave it like we regularly leave 2D planes and enter others. We are always in it. But even this concept of traveling through requires another dimension to go forward in time. So a three-dimensional bit of space going forward in time is essentially what the fourth dimension looks like to us. But drawing these next few dimensions would get really confusing. So we're going just to imagine an instantaneous snippet of time to be reduced to the concept of a cube instead of a point, so that I don't have to draw like 4 different lines to try to intuitively help imagine the fourth dimension. So for the drawing, we will now connect that instantaneous snippet of 3D space and connect it to any different orientation of 3D space. And they have these 2 points point infinity vectors at each other. And fire. Yeah, I kind of just alluded to the fact that time goes infinity into the past, but if you can trust me for a second, put a pin in that, and I will get into why and time goes for infinity in the past in a little bit. But for now, know that time is a new dimension type, something different and distinct from length. So, for us at least, there hasn't been an observed fourth dimension of length found in our reality, or our part of the everything I'm trying to build a theory to explain. So measuring anything that is fourth dimensional for us would not be length to the fourth, but rather length to the third times time, or really any phenomenon that multiplies 4 different dimensions together. Mass times length squared times time would also be used to measure a 4D phenomena. So if you want to get technical on the terminology, standard movies are already fourth dimensional to us, using height, width, time, duration, and electric current to portray a story. So what we call 3D movies give us the illusion of depth, and although is technically still 4-dimensional, tricks our mind into thinking it is 5-dimensional. So speaking of which, what is the 5th dimension? It is an infinite array of timelines that are parallel to our own. So for this example, all the timelines up until this point are synchronized. So like everything in the past that is negative to us would be the same no matter what timeline you go before this point. So in the 5th dimension, let's take a macroscopic example instead of trying to use the quantum examples. You can imagine that you are very indecisive about what you are going to eat, and you will definitely eat the first thing that comes to your mind. So we'll say that in this timeline, you choose to eat a bag of chips. This timeline, you decide to eat ice cream. This time, you choose to eat bubblegum. And this timeline, you choose to go vegan and eat a bunch of tofu. So whatever goes on after that point in each of those individual timelines of your very indecisive self will create different outcomes in your life. Like if you become vegan in the tofu, you could decide to be vegan for the rest of your life, or even on this later on this 5-dimensional timeline, that tofu could end up being bad, and you could end up not going vegan if the tofu is bad. Yeah, there's a lot of different possibilities in the fifth dimension, and an infinite amount of possibilities that happen at the quantum realm. So if you let's say that even if one single particle is decoherent within all of the universe, that decoherent particle would result in a different timeline, even if it doesn't have any causal effect on local systems. So it's like even what you are observing right now could happen an infinite amount of times. All it would take is just one new particle happening in a distant, faraway galaxy for a new timeline to happen here, if that makes sense. Again, I'll try to say that our present is currently our only viable point of singularity in the fifth dimension. And I'm going to save most of the philosophical illustrations for this dimension for part 8, so you should probably like and subscribe and plan on watching that part later. So we are now up to length to the third and time to the second. Now, before we go on to the sixth dimension and beyond, it would probably be better for me to introduce and explain a sub-theory within my theory of everything, and that is the theory of omniversal supersymmetry. So visualize the 0D point again. I theorize that everything that exists within the multidimensional omniverse comes from and is also contained within this point. Since with math logic, I have shown that everything can come out of nothing, namely 0 divided by 0 equals everything, what we call the Big Bang is the beginning of the omniverse's calculations of what exactly everything looks like, while simultaneously maintaining its numerical identity as 0. And the whole supersymmetry aspect of the theory states that for every unique state a given universe can be in, there is an equivalent amount of particles and antiparticles, positive and negative mass, positive and negative charge, and positive and negative time, that if all of the collective universes were to collide back into the same area, the net number of the stuff from the resulting collision would equal 0. So this is where the concept of anti-time, or time going for infinity prior to the Big Bang, comes from. Time itself didn't exist, quote-unquote, before the Big Bang. Time, length, mass, electric currents, and all quantifiable quantities equaled 0, quote-unquote, before the Big Bang. With all these possibilities of decoherence happening in the fifth dimension, and with our past already set in stone, I'm not afraid to admit at the possibility of being wrong on this or any point, that our future is also set in stone. And free will is an illusion, and strict determinism is the correct philosophy on this matter. But I personally think that we are endowed by our DNA, our socioeconomic status, our education, our experiences, and our psychological motivations, and similar building blocks that make ourselves unique. And what I mean is that I believe that these things determine our actions more so than the plethora of potential outcomes. Certain stimuli demand our attention, and we can still choose and be certain to not even engage with said stimuli. And that's like part of your personality. So it's like not everything that can happen will happen within the fifth dimension. That was the theory of omniversal supersymmetry, and some key points on the subject of free will and determinism that I will go into even deeper detail in part 8. So again, like and subscribe for notifications on those later parts. But what can be said of the sixth dimension? It is every possibility, like every 5D plane of possibilities happening at every single Planck second being accessible. So let's just pretend that this is a timeline, and at this point is the point of the dinosaurs getting extinct, and this is what our normal timeline looks like. But back at that point, there's the possibility, well, actually it was more like a few thousand years before that, something else hit the asteroid to prevent it from colliding into Earth to make the dinosaurs extinct. So that would make the timeline of the dinosaurs continuing their evolution to be an accessible point in 6D space. Like, we can't access that right now. We are only accessible to the 5D plane of possibilities in the present. This is why I call this the variable eternal dimension, because we can access every point of possibilities that can happen with our 3D space at every point in time. To elaborate, the 5D plane of possibilities are conceptually observable at the Planck second. Observers of the plane cannot go back and change the past, nor can they go forward and be certain if Schrödinger's cat is dead or alive. But in 6D space, we can conceptually see what would have happened in the universe at every possible point, and all of the possible future evolutions of life, or lack of life, on our planet. We could see all of the pathways of Schrödinger's cat being alive and dead and non-existent, and being named someone else's cat, and being named Schrödinger's dog instead at the same time. Every possible way that could have gone, and every possible way that will be able to happen, and would be contained within this third time dimension. Does this mean that every way will happen? No. I've said this before. Only the ways that are causally possible. We cannot go where we have no means or motivations to go. And so long as nothing forces us to move against our will, there is no scenario that necessarily transports us to every possible space, at every possible location, at every time in our lives. We can be confident, nearing 100% confident, that we aren't suddenly going to be transported outside of the observable universe in the next nanosecond. Conceptually possible and causally possible are distinct from each other. And we may never know if any possibility we can conceptualize will come to fruition within the sixth dimension. Since the pattern has been pretty well laid out, I can take the liberty of summarizing the seventh, eighth, and ninth dimensions, even though they manifest themselves differently. This is why I didn't start with mass as the first dimension, as an infinite mass line doesn't make much sense by itself. But if you make a mass line a line of 3D space configuration, so pretend that this is a mass line instead of a timeline, different particle mass variations happening at different points in space make a little bit more sense. The Higgs field is everywhere at once, but changes in the field gives us mass at different points of the field. The mass line / the Higgs field goes through every point in space, just like time or causality goes through every point in space. And for the 8th and 9th dimensions to be explained, the electric and magnetic fields are similar to the Higgs field and go through every point in space. And the magnetic field oscillates from the electric field at 90-degree angles. And since electromagnetic waves travel the universe as waves, they require 3 spatial dimensions to be observed by us. 2 to watch the photon moving up and down along a plane, and a 3rd dimension to allow the magnetic field's waves to come up off of the plane left and right at 90-degree angles. And now for the 10th dimension, the dimension of stable physics, is where we conclude this video. Finally looking into that interesting 4th time dimension. Honestly, I'm not at all sure what this dimension would manifest as, or if it really is just a single dimension to us, or if it is multiple dimensions that just happen to be stable for us. Here are a couple of possibilities that could happen at the level that we call the 4th time dimension. For one, every iteration that physics can manifest as stable should be able to happen on this line. It's like every possible starting condition for what we call physics would be stable and constant on this line. And our universe just happens to be on a single point on this 10D line. The question is, could one physics state be causally connected to another physics state? I don't know. And this is an untold premise that I had to conclude that we live in a simulation. If the 10th dimension was like a 9D line, there's nothing that says a 90 point halfway through its eternal dissemination would necessarily have any causal connections to another point with different physics on this 10D line. Deviating to an 11th dimension would be a lot more likely, with having at least one variable physics dimension. And if variable physics could occur, a second thing that would happen is that the number of dimensions would increase. By how much? I don't know. The number of unbounded dimensions within the true everything is another untold premise I had to conclude that we live in a simulation. I would love to simply believe that there are universes out there with 4 length dimensions in their dimensional repertoire. 4D topology is a very interesting subject to learn about. But alas, we have no way of proving that these universes exist anywhere outside of our imaginations. And considering this one universe we observe, if we were to know everything about physics, everything that we would know would be only applicable to one point on the 10D line. How's that for humility? So next time I'm going to propose a new measuring system that builds upon the calculated quantum manifestations of each of the dimensions. And until next time, kumbaya, mother duckers.